Might need Mr. A here.
Mr. Joyce.
Mr. Arnold.
I can't reach this. All right, so did I give you a grade? We've talked in the past about sexual and asexual reproduction. We've talked about evolution, and they're related because in order for a species to survive in a changing environment, in order for natural selection to actually work, you need to have some variation within the species. And sexual reproduction and in plants, cross-pollination adds to that variation. Now, the notes that you guys have for this unit are slightly different. There's been some changes that we made since they were printed out. So the word you have is variation is important for evolution, variation. And cross-pollination helps to increase that variation because we're combining traits from two different individuals to form an embryo. And so that adds to the variety. Think back to natural selection, we started with variation, that the individuals in a group are all different from each other. They're not identical. And then there's this struggle to survive, struggle to find food, struggle to avoid predators and so forth. And there are some of those individuals may happen to have variations that are helpful, that help them survive better, help them reproduce more. And that leads to them reproducing and passing those beneficial traits onto their offspring. And over a long period of time, this happens over and over again, and that's what leads to adaptations and the evolution of a species over time. So variation is good for a species. And sexual reproduction is one means of increasing that variation. But if one single plant fertilizes its own cells, well, that's not very helpful because it's just one single species, one single individual fertilizing its own ovules, and so there's not a lot of extra variation. So there's lots of ways that plants be sure that doesn't happen. Several ways to avoid self-pollination. Because when I showed you those pictures of the flowers last week, we had the male anthers that produce pollen, and then we had the female pistil, which has the stigma where that pollen attaches. If it's all in one flower, well, then you would think, the pollen just falls on the stigma and then it fertilizes it. But there's different ways that plants have of not allowing that to happen. One way is with the timing. Because in many flowers, the male parts, the stamen, matures at a different time than the pistil matures. So they're not mature and not all those parts are working in a single flower. And so as the pollen is produced in the stamen, okay, that pollen can't fertilize the stigma in the same flower because it's not yet mature. You can fertilize a different flower somewhere else. Another is that flowers often don't contain both the male and the female reproductive parts in them. Sometimes in a flower, there's only the male stamens. Other times in a flower, there's only the female pistil. Okay, so that helps to avoid self-pollination. Also, there are biochemical ways, chemicals that make it so that if pollen from a single flower lands on the stigma of the same flower, it doesn't fertilize. And so the reason for all of this is because the more cross-pollination that happens, the more variation there will be in the species. Some plants are even, a lot of trees, for example, are, basically the tree has a gender to it. That on one tree, every flower on that tree will only have stamens, will only have the male part. And then another tree somewhere else, on all of its flowers, only has the female parts, only has the pistil in its flower. So sometimes trees almost have a gender. This flower, so a perfect flower is the name if it has both parts in it. This is an imperfect flower. Is this a male or female flower? Raise your hand. I think you know. Graceland? Yeah, it has just that single pistil in the middle. What about this flower? That's male because it has the anthers, 4 anthers in it. So those are imperfect flowers to encourage cross-pollination. So how does the pollen get from flower to flower? We know that plants don't get up and move. They're not like animals that they can go find a mate. So how does the pollen get from the flower of one flower or one tree to another? Well, there's 2 big categories that we'll talk about. Destiny?
Bumblebees?
Yeah. Often there are animal pollinators that carry pollen from one plant to another. And then the other main way, Jasmine, is the wind blows the pollen from one plant to another.
Isn't that
Yeah.
what
So wind pollination is common, especially common in trees and stuff. And in wind pollination, the flowers of the tree are slightly different. They often have the anthers exposed so that they're sort of just hanging out there. Because when they produce pollen, the pollen can be taken by the wind. Usually the actual pollen grains are very light. And there's many, many of them, so that they can be transported by the wind. Often the petals of the flower are small so that they don't enclose the anthers, so that they're not protected. So the wind, as it blows pollen all around, some of it lands on the female parts of a flower and fertilizes it. You know, you probably notice this in the spring when flowers are blooming on trees in your neighborhood. You may come out and your driveway's coated with yellow pollen. That's from wind-pollinated species that release their pollen and the wind carried it. It may be all over the car and you have to wipe the windows before you go somewhere. That's because of that pollen. Many of us are allergic to that pollen. As we breathe it in the air, it bothers us. And so all that pollen that's on the driveway, it's on your car, bothering your allergies, well, some of it actually lands on another flower and pollinates it. Then, like you guys said, animals are the other main category. Many animals carry pollen from flower to flower. Insects can do it. Birds can do it. Even mammals and sometimes reptiles and amphibians transfer pollen from one flower to another. We call those pollinators. The most common are the insects, and then the birds, and then mammals and reptiles and amphibians are less common. Here you see pollen blowing out of the flowers of this plant, being transported through the wind. Here you have a mouse feeding in a flower that's going to get pollen on it and then transfer it to another flower. And there are many cases of plants and then animals that have evolved together. We call this coevolution. When 2 species that live in the same area have evolved together to have sort of matching characteristics. They've affected each other's evolution. Often it's very easy to see in birds, in their bill of birds that feed in flowers. It's like hummingbirds, for example. If you look at a hummingbird's bill and its length, its shape, it will match perfectly with the flowers that it feeds on. It's evolved over time. The flower has evolved to be a certain shape. The hummingbird has evolved to have a similar shaped beak. And it fits perfectly so that the hummingbird can get as much nectar as possible and the flower can get pollinated as often as possible. Some insects like this moth and this very long proboscis that it uses to feed. This is the type of flower it feeds. And you can see its proboscis is the perfect length to fit in here down at the end of that flower so that it can get its nectar. So these 2 species have kind of evolved together to be matching. Many flowers have markings on them that we can't actually see. You know how we can hear certain sounds that like a dog, we can't hear certain sounds that a dog can hear? Or another animal? The same is true of seeing. That there are certain colors we cannot see. They're beyond the wavelength of what we can perceive. But other animals sometimes can see those colors. The ultraviolet spectrum is part of that. Here are some just sort of yellow looking flowers to us. dandelion and maybe a buttercup or whatever. But when you take a picture using ultraviolet camera, you can actually see the markings that many animals can see. You can see that there are actually multiple colors here. And this same thing in this dandelion, the outer areas have a different color than the central area. So bees, for example, can see that. We cannot, but they help to attract and allow insects to know that this is a flower that they can feed from. Destiny?
There's like a UV pen too. Is that like the same way?
Could be. I've never heard of that, but yeah. Yeah, and then you shine a light on it and you can see, yeah, same idea. So the pollen itself, the male gamete of plants, often its shape and its texture is related to how it gets from place to place. These spiky little pollen grains here, they're spiky so that they can stick to an animal that pollinates it. So as, say, a bee, for example, visits a flower, some of this pollen will stick to it, and then when it goes and feeds on a different flower, some of that pollen will be transferred. Wind-pollinated species have usually very smooth pollen grains. They're very lightweight, they're small, so that they can travel as far as possible on wind currents. So why do animals go and visit these flowers? Why do bees go from flower to flower, or hummingbirds? Avery?
Make like food.
Yeah, they're getting something from those plants. They're getting a reward of food. And that's why they visit the flowers. They're not going there to pollinate, they're going there to feed. Pollination is something that happens to take place by chance. What do animals get from a flower? What kind of food? What are we talking about? Destiny?
Bees get honey.
Well, they make honey using something they get from the flower. In the flower, we don't call it honey. Garrett?
Glucose?
Yeah, they get sugar through this, though. Bella? Nectar. We call it nectar, this liquid, this sugary liquid that's in flowers. Does anyone have like a hummingbird feeder at home? You fill up with like a red liquid, right? Did you ever make the red liquid part?
Yeah.
What is it?
Water and sugar.
It's just basically sugar water. It's usually colored with like food coloring or something. Because the hummingbirds are attracted to that color. But it's just sugar water. That's what insects are getting, or birds are getting when they visit these flowers. They're getting this sugar that they're using for energy. Some of them also will eat the pollen itself, which has nutrients in it, protein and other nutrients. So bees can eat the pollen as well as the nectar. And so these pollinators visit the flowers, they're feeding, and at the same time, they're getting some pollen on them that they will spread from flower to flower.
Is that a dog?
That's
And
a bat.
that's a bat. And also an interesting fact is that the nectar's amount of sugar in it is carefully matched to the animals that pollinate it. That, a bird or a bat, they need a certain amount of sugar in the solution that's different from an insect. And so when flowers pollinated by insects, they'll have the correct level of sugar in it. Here's probably the most common animal pollinator, a bee. This bee's obviously visited a flower because what's covering it?
Pollen.
Yeah, those are pollen grains. So as the bee visited the plant, fed on the nectar, it got covered in pollen. It brushed up against the anthers and got this pollen all over it.
Do they have like special hairs to do it?
No, the pollen is like sticky. It has little hooks and stuff that when it gets on it attaches. So the bees visit these flowers. They get pollen on them. They eat some of the pollen. They eat the nectar. Bees then bring that nectar back to their hive and regurgitate it, store it for later. Now sometimes humans gather up that regurgitated nectar and eat it, and that's what honey is. Honey is the regurgitated nectar that these bees got from the plants, put it in their hive, and we gather it sometimes.
How come the pollen isn't sticky to us?
It's got little, because it's sticky to like the bees are kind of fuzzy and hairy, and it sticks onto those little hairs. But some of it could get on. Yeah, it's a little sticky. So bees are really interesting. Bees feed on nectar, obviously, bring back to their hive, make honey. Bees return back to their hive each day, every night. Some people keep bees, to gather honey and for other reasons. And bees are actually very smart. They're social insects,
So why do they say
which
that?
means bees have different jobs in the hive. And some bees' job is to go out, fly away from the hive, find flowers or some source of nectar, come back to the hive, and then show the other bees where it is. And the way they do this is with a special dance.
Did you say dance?
Dance. Bees have this thing they call the waggle dance.
Are you serious?
So as a bee goes out, it finds a little cluster of flowers with great nectar, flies back to the hive, and as it gets back to the hive, other bees in the hive watch it, and it does a little dance. And the dance that it does is it makes little figure eights. It loops around to the right, then it loops around to the left.
Really?
And the number of times it makes its loops tell the other bees how far away they need to fly. How far is the plant? The angle that they do that tells the other bees what direction to fly in. So after this bee returns to the hive, does his little waggle dance, and the other bees that watch it, they now know, okay, to go find this patch of flowers, I need to fly 60 degrees from north, I need to fly for 300 feet, and that's where the
I
nectar
don't know,
should
watch
be.
that during the summer.
So it's pretty interesting that how bees sort of work together to form the hive and to do all these things.
Your hand, feel like walking figurations, or they flying?
Yeah, no, they do a little walking dance.
They do what they
They do the waggle dance. Bowman?
So how is like flower kind of?
Yeah, kind of like, yep. Jasmine? No.
Is it possible to stick like a small video camera in a bee?
Yeah, that's how they found this out. By recording inside of a hive, they record the little dance they do. And scientists figured out what it actually means by watching where the bees came from, what kind of little dance they do. Yeah,
How do they figure that
it's
out?
pretty neat. Just by carefully observing. If you're watching the hive and you know this bee came from here, and then when it gets back, you watch its dance. And you watch this lots and lots of times, you could start to figure out, okay, what these different things it does, what they mean. Again, here is an example of those nectar guides. This ultraviolet coloring that we can't perceive, but bees can. Butterflies and moths are also insect pollinators. Butterflies and moths have this proboscis that they put into the flower to extract the nectar. You can see this is the proboscis of this moth
Is it like a little
or this
stem?
butterfly. And it pokes into the flower, gets the nectar, and at the same time, those insects can get pollen on them that they spread from flower to flower.
Wait, do
So
like
it's
the
like a
butterflies
little-
like people
Yeah,
curl up?
no, uncoils and goes into the flower. And often, the flower they feed from is exactly matched to the length of the proboscis.
Wait, it's like a little tube.
Yeah, the little tube, they suck up it's like a straw.
But the bee was just like all.
Well, because the bees work differently. They don't have to reach way into flowers. They just put their head in there.
No, but like the pollen is all like clumpy on them, but then and then she's got.
Yeah, that's because the flowers they feed from have a long section that they have to reach into. And as they reach into it, they get the pollen on them. Moth pollinated flowers are usually light in color because moths generally are active at the night and they can't see well in the day.
Flies.
Even flies and beetles can sometimes feed in flowers. Now, where do you think of flies as, what do they eat?
Raw meat.
Food that we make.
Yeah, garbage, right? Decaying material, rotting flesh, like roadkill. There are actually some flowers. There's one flower called the corpse flower. And it smells like rotting flesh, like dead animals.
That's
Cool.
And they smell like that to attract flies, beetles, pollinators that generally eat dead things. And often flies will visit these types of flowers, lay their eggs because they think it's actually decaying, rotting meat. but it's actually not, but they get pollen on them, and then they can pollinate those flowers. There's one, that corpse flower only blooms once every 7 to 10 years and smells really, really bad, but it attracts its pollinators. Birds have good color sense. So often flowers that are pollinated by birds are brightly colored or have intricate patterns. They don't really have a great sense of smell, so often a flower that is pollinated by birds doesn't have a strong scent, strong odor. And usually the birds are feeding off of nectar that's inside of the flower. And again, things like hummingbirds can reach their bill into the right spot of the flower to extract that nectar. Even mammals, bats for example, sometimes feed from flowers at nighttime. Often those are white flowers. They get pollen on them. Even some mice, as they feed on plants, can spread pollen from plants. So some of the ways that plants attract pollinators: by their color, their smell, by those markings, those nectar guides, which guide the insects to the right spot. Bees, for example, see pretty well in the blue and yellow end of the spectrum. So often, flowers like these, that are blue and yellow, they are meant to be pollinated by bees. They attract bees. Birds see better in the red end of the spectrum. So bird-pollinated flowers are often red in color. If you know, if you have a hummingbird feeder, you make the nectar red and the feeder itself is usually red. And some plants even mimic other insects. We talked about these when we talked about mimicry, that some plants have evolved to look like insects. So here we have some plants that look like an insect. These are actually the petals of the plant. It looks like an insect, and a male will try to mate with a flower. Even it thinks it's a female, even though it's a part of the plant, it will try to mate with it, and in the process, pollinate it. Just get pollen on it.
Ew. Trying to write my left hand.
Yeah. All right, let's go with seeds. We'll start with seeds tomorrow because I want to talk about seeds and fruits, and that'll take a little while. We won't have a chance probably to finish this class. So we'll stop here for today.
I can't write left-handed. I can't